requires a stressed tree in order to successfully colonize it. So that indicates that these trees have a problem, that they have stress. So in order to get them to grow better, we want to give them more sunlight by cutting the trees that, such as the Z beech and the ones that have this dead branch. It's not a branch stub, but a dead shoot off the side. Cutting those out are going to give the trees with more potential more sunlight, and they're going to grow better. They're going to be healthier because, like I mentioned before with the hemlock woolly adelgid, is anytime you decrease the, we call it live crown ratio, and that's just the percentage of healthy, live, photosynthetically active leaf surface area that a tree has. Anytime that decreases, that begins to stress the tree too. So you have these compounding stressors, and one of which is when you start to lose that live crown ratio. That's the whole purpose behind thinning out stands that are too dense. It's almost as if like planting carrots. If you plant carrots and they come in too thick and there's too much competition between the carrots, they're not going to grow as well as if you thin them out and they get more sunlight around the top of the plant, which is akin to the crown of the tree. So it's a kind of very similar sort of analogy to that.
And that's critical to understand.
We're not interested in timber harvest. I mean, won't this self-thin in time anyway? And in the meantime, it'll, you'll get wildlife benefits as they get disease and decay. Plus,
mushrooms.
Keeping the soil, mushrooms. I mean, keeping soil moisture in, and I mean, why not just let it take care of itself?
It will do that over time, but at the same time, the trees that have the potential to be the best trees in the forest are going to be suppressed at the same time too.
So where's the next generation coming from, right? Then
really it kind of goes, it comes down to directing the course of that thinning by saying, okay, we want to take out these lesser trees, and we know even though that some of those lesser trees, they are going to succumb to these things that are going to stress them naturally, that if you can do that, then you begin to direct it on a desirable path and pick the trees that you want to have left behind to grow. Because if they just keep competing with each other, and the competition is felt first amongst the trees in the subordinate position, so that you have trees that are suppressed or already kind of in the understory, they're going to be a little bit more suppressed because they're not getting enough sunlight, or they're kind of the runts of the stand, so to speak. So that those more dominant trees and the dominant ones that have the highest crown positions are going to feel the effects of that competition more slowly than the ones that are suppressed in intermediate crown positions.
I'm just thinking, like, that's a forestry perspective, and I'm maybe coming at it more from an ecological perspective, where, I mean, you just sort of let it go and it sort of sorts itself out over time. I'm just a question,
I think that would be a fine approach to take, minus the past effects that I have just discussed before with the past high grading, because we've already put it into a condition where it's degraded already. It's not as if we're starting with a new, healthy, clean slate of a forest to work with, and then letting those natural thinning agents, because they are. Diseases are natural thinning agents of any population, of any species. But the thing is, if we're in a bad position to begin with, in a state of degradation, to then take your hands off and say, well, we're just going to let it sort itself out, to me is counterproductive, because we have the science-based knowledge to know what to do and to do it. But there again, it goes back to your objectives. If you really don't want to have any kind of disturbance, and you don't want to cut trees and take any kind of active approach to do this rehabilitation that I'm talking about, then you can do that and just let it go and wait and see what happens.
Well, I guess if you cut, so say you do the cutting you're talking about, then you still have the issue of regeneration, right?
Right.
So, and that's where you do what?
that's where, here again, the fern
Yeah.
is a huge problem
Yeah.
because that's going to prevent any type of regeneration.
Uh-huh.
But the thing is, you have to differentiate between a thinning and a regeneration cut. If we were cutting this to regenerate this, you're going to be cutting it back to a much lower residual density than if you're doing a timber stand improvement, which is what this is. A timber stand improvement is an intermediate cut that's intended to tend the current forest, not necessarily to regenerate a new forest, because we wouldn't want to do anything here like at Frost Valley where we saw the shelterwood cut. That's a pretty intensive cut, but it's intended to create a regeneration response, whereas this is a tending cut to get some of the Uggs out of the population. And this would go back to the inventory that would be part of the management plan. Each stand is going to have an inventory so that you know how densely stocked that stand is. It may be at a point where it really doesn't require any kind of thinning because the trees are all getting enough sunlight. The competition between the trees is not so bad that you're starting to see decline from that or losing live crown ratio or anything. That's a situation where you might want to just say hands off. But then again, that will be things that are articulated in your management plan and prioritized based on what areas are most important to treat and what your objectives are.
Yeah.
So in this stand, what's marked blue would be part of the thinning?
Right.
Got it.
Or potentially girdling, if
Girdling.
that's what, if you'd rather create the standing dead wood for
And
habitat.
so if that happens and then there's a deer exclosure, are the ferns going to keep, I mean, my understanding before was that with the exclosure in place, then some of these the high value trees would start to have seedlings and then start to grow up. But is that not going to happen because this is not a regenerative plan?
Ideally, what's going to happen is if there are sufficient gaps created in the overstory to allow for regeneration, even though this is not intended as a regeneration cut, and you have deer fencing, and you're able to control the beech and the fern, then a lot of it depends on the shade tolerance of the tree. Like with the maples, like I've said before, they're very shade tolerant. You'll see some of the, well, not right here, but there are areas where you'll see a young maple in the understory. We call that advanced regeneration. So it's a tree that came up even though there wasn't any kind of cutting because it's a shade tolerant species. You see that with the beech, the sugar maple, and the hemlock. Whereas if you had a stand, that was dominated by cherry, which requires more sunlight, it's less shade tolerant. If you wanted to get regeneration of that cherry, you'd have to do something like a shelter wood, like we did at Frost Valley.
Okay, we need to wrap up, folks.
Yep.
So thank you very much.
Thank you very
There'll be a
much.
quiz when we get back inside.